Kafka's philosophy is one that challenges the very foundations of how we view existence, identity, and freedom. It is a philosophy rooted in the absurdity of life, where meaning seems just out of reach, and every attempt to grasp it only pushes it further away. Franz Kafka's works, though often bleak and unsettling, offer profound insights into how we can navigate a world that doesn't make sense, a world that constantly pushes back against our attempts to find meaning. At the core of Kafka's thought is a deep understanding of the alienation that comes with the modern condition. His characters, trapped in bureaucratic nightmares or in existential crises, struggle to make sense of their own identities in a world that offers them no solid answers. These struggles, however, are not confined to the characters in his stories. They mirror the very real struggles we face in our own lives. How often do we feel lost in a world that is full of rules we didn't make, systems that don't care about us, and a society that often values us only for what we can contribute? Kafka's works ask us to consider not just how we are oppressed by external forces, but how we often oppress ourselves through our own need for control, meaning, and validation. Kafka's characters are often trapped by forces they cannot understand, whether it's the faceless bureaucracy of the trial, the impenetrable system of authority in the castle, or the emotional and social alienation faced by Gregor Samsa in the Metamorphosis. These characters are alienated from others, but more importantly, they are alienated from themselves. They exist in a world that treats them as expendable, and in trying to navigate that world, they lose a sense of who they are. Kafka's exploration of this alienation speaks to a universal experience. We are all, in some way, alienated from society, from our families, and sometimes even from our own sense of self. His stories are not simply about the loneliness of the individual, but about the existential loneliness that comes when we realize that the world we live in doesn't offer us the answers we crave. Kafka's work often raises the question of freedom, what it is, where it comes from, and how we can achieve it. But Kafka's idea of freedom is not about breaking free from external constraints. Rather, it's about finding freedom within ourselves. His characters, whether trying to understand the incomprehensible systems that surround them or simply trying to survive, are all searching for some kind of personal autonomy. They want to control their lives, to make sense of their suffering, and to understand why they exist. Kafka's philosophy tells us that true freedom does not come from escaping the system, but from accepting that the system is beyond our control and living with it anyway. Freedom, for Kafka, is found in the acceptance of life's absurdity, in acknowledging that we are powerless against the greater forces of life, but still choosing to live authentically in spite of it. In a world where so much of our existence is dictated by forces we don't fully understand, Kafka's works offer us a profound reflection on how to live in such a world. His works do not give us easy answers or resolutions. Instead, they ask us to confront the reality of life's inherent meaninglessness. Kafka's characters never find a definitive answer to their struggles, nor do they find a way out of their circumstances. But in the process of navigating their absurd worlds, they offer us lessons about how to live, how to cope, and how to embrace the chaos. At the heart of Kafka's philosophy is an acceptance of life as it is, with all of its messiness, absurdity, and unpredictability, rather than seeking a way to escape. Kafka asks us to find freedom in the acceptance of that chaos. Life, he suggests, may not have an inherent meaning, but that doesn't mean we can't create our own meaning within it. Kafka's works teach us that failure is not something to be feared, it is a part of life. And in some ways, it may even be a beautiful part of life. The struggle, the absurdity, the chaos, these are not things to be avoided or escaped, but things to be embraced as part of what it means to be human. Kafka's characters often fail in the most tragic and beautiful ways, but their failures aren't meaningless, they are human. In their struggles, we see a reflection of our own. Kafka's philosophy doesn't offer us easy solutions or simple answers. Instead, it invites us to live with the questions, to embrace the discomfort of not knowing, and to find meaning not in a destination, but in the journey itself. Through Kafka's lens, we can learn to see the beauty in the chaos of our own lives, to accept the things we cannot change, and to find freedom in the acceptance of life's absurdity. By focusing on Kafka's exploration of alienation, freedom, and failure, we can begin to understand that the very things we often fear or avoid are the very things that can lead us to a deeper sense of authenticity and self-understanding. Life may not offer us the certainty we crave, but Kafka's work reminds us that it's in the uncertainty, the failure, and the absurdity where we can truly find our freedom. Kafka's works are a window into the human condition, often highlighting the absurdity and meaninglessness of existence. At first glance, his stories may seem grim or even hopeless, but what they actually offer is a profound, albeit unsettling, understanding of how we grapple with life itself. Kafka's philosophy asks the uncomfortable question: what happens when we face the harsh reality that life doesn't offer inherent meaning or purpose? The key to understanding Kafka is his deep engagement with existential thought, particularly the works of thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche and Soren Kierkegaard. These philosophers posited that human existence is inherently absurd. The world offers no clear, definitive meaning, and instead of finding a grand purpose, individuals are left to wrestle with an overwhelming sense of uncertainty and disillusionment. While Nietzsche famously declared that God is dead, and Kierkegaard spoke of the anxiety inherent in human freedom, Kafka takes these ideas even further by showing us characters who live in a world where even the search for meaning seems futile. What makes Kafka's existentialism so compelling and also so deeply uncomfortable is his emphasis on the lack of meaning in everyday life. He doesn't just portray human suffering in the abstract. He shows us individuals who are trapped in systems that offer no real chance of escape or understanding. Whether it's the Kafkaesque bureaucracy that imprisons Joseph K. in the trial, or the impossibly convoluted society K. encounters in the castle, Kafka presents a world where human beings are not the center of the universe. Instead, they are reduced to mere cogs in a machine, endlessly struggling to navigate a system that they don't fully understand and have no power to influence. Kafka's characters are often completely alienated from the world around them, stuck in a state of existential paralysis. Kafka's characters don't simply face suffering, they face a lack of meaning that amplifies their suffering. And here's the crucial part. In Kafka's world, there is no escape. His protagonists rarely find any answers, let alone resolution, to their struggles. The trial shows Joseph K. arrested for an unspecified crime, a process that plays out in a nightmarish sequence of bureaucratic absurdity. Similarly, the castle portrays chaos, endless, futile attempts to gain access to an elusive authority that never quite materializes. Kafka is not just documenting the injustices of the world. He's showing us the absurdity of the world itself, how systems, whether legal, social, or familial, can entrap us in an endless cycle of struggle without offering us the relief of understanding. In Kafka's world, truth is elusive, and meaning is a mirage. His characters often seek meaning in vain. They follow rules that don't make sense, engage in rituals that lead nowhere, and confront powers that seem not only beyond their control, but also indifferent to their existence. There's a sense of hopelessness in Kafka's work, not just because his characters suffer, but because they realize that their suffering may have no purpose at all. In fact, the more they try to make sense of their world, the more they seem to deepen their confusion. This brings us to a difficult truth that Kafka's work forces us to face. Meaning is something we create, not something we find. The search for meaning, Kafka suggests, can itself become a trap, a never-ending cycle that leads to greater despair. His characters are often so consumed by trying to understand their circumstances that they lose sight of the possibility that life might not have a grand, overarching purpose. Rather than find relief, they only deepen their entanglement in the maze of existence. Kafka's work challenges us to confront our own assumptions about life and meaning. It asks us to let go of the belief that everything must have a reason, that every action must have a purpose, and that every life must have significance. Kafka seems to suggest that perhaps the greatest freedom lies in accepting life's meaninglessness. In doing so, we no longer have to struggle against an indifferent world, trying to fit into a structure that wasn't designed for us. Instead, we can focus on the present moment, accepting life as it comes, imperfections, absurdities, and all. This is not to say that Kafka's philosophy is an excuse for passivity or nihilism. On the contrary, his work often demonstrates the stubborn persistence of the individual in the face of overwhelming odds. Even when Kafka's characters realize that the world around them offers no answers, they continue to fight. The trial ends with Joseph K. facing his execution, but even in his final moments, he protests, trying to make sense of the system that condemns him. Kafka's characters might be caught in an absurd world, but they don't surrender. Their actions, even when they seem meaningless or futile, reflect a profound human resilience, the willingness to continue, even when we know we might never understand why. In many ways, Kafka's existentialism is liberating. In a world that doesn't offer us easy answers or a clear sense of direction, the act of embracing life's absurdity can actually free us. If nothing has meaning, then we are no longer beholden to the expectations of others or the pressure to fit into a preordained structure. Kafka's characters often fight against this very structure, and their struggles are reflections of our own battles against the systems that constrain us, whether it's societal expectations, cultural norms, or even internalized beliefs about success and failure. Kafka's work urges us to step back and question those assumptions. What if meaning is not something to be discovered, but something we create for ourselves? The real challenge of Kafka's philosophy is in its radical honesty. It forces us to confront the darkest aspects of human existence, our fear of meaninglessness, our struggle against overwhelming systems, and our search for purpose in a world that doesn't offer one. But in doing so, it also offers a path forward. By accepting the absurdity of existence, we may find the freedom to live more fully, to embrace life for what it is, rather than what we want it to be. Kafka's world may be chaotic, but it is in that chaos that we can find the potential for something more genuine, more human. Kafka's work also invites us to question the assumptions that shape our own lives. We live in a world that is filled with expectations, the pressure to succeed, to make sense of our relationships, to achieve, to prove our worth. Kafka shows us that all of this is illusory. The systems we try so hard to navigate, the roles we try to fit into, the labels we try to wear, these are the very things that imprison us. And it is only by rejecting the need to conform to these external demands that we can find the kind of freedom Kafka speaks of. Kafka's philosophy is unsettling because it doesn't offer easy answers or comforting reassurances. Instead, it presents a world that is indifferent, absurd, and ultimately meaningless. But perhaps that's the point. When we stop searching for meaning in the wrong places, we can begin to live authentically, embracing the world as it is, rather than trying to bend it to our will. By confronting the meaninglessness of existence head-on, Kafka allows us to see that life is not a puzzle to solve, but an experience to be lived. And in that experience, we are free to define our own meaning, no matter how fleeting, how absurd, or how strange it may be. Kafka's exploration of freedom in his works is nothing short of profound. He doesn't depict freedom as something we can simply attain by escaping external systems or by breaking free from oppressive societal structures. Instead, he invites us to examine freedom as an internal state, something that is shaped not by external circumstances, but by our own perceptions and mental frameworks. Kafka's characters often live in worlds filled with unyielding authority and systems that crush the individual spirit. But perhaps the most critical aspect of Kafka's work is the way these characters come to realize that the true source of their oppression lies not in the systems themselves, but in their own psychological entrapment. Take the trial. For example, the story follows Joseph K., who is suddenly arrested for an unspecified crime, without being told what the crime is or why he's being punished. The legal system he finds himself navigating is completely irrational and inaccessible. It's faceless, cold, and bureaucratic. No one will explain the charges to him. No one seems to care about the truth. The more Joseph K. tries to fight for his innocence, the more the system closes in on him, becoming more absurd and more oppressive at every turn. He spends his entire life battling something that he can't understand, let alone change. And ultimately, the legal system consumes him in the end. On the surface, This appears to be a story of an individual struggling to escape an oppressive social system. However, Kafka's real brilliance lies in his portrayal of the internal prison. In the trial, Joseph K. is not simply a victim of a faceless legal machine. He's also a prisoner of his own mind, trapped in a web of delusions about justice, morality, and the possibility of escape. Kafka's characters rarely break free of their circumstances because they never fully confront the illusion of freedom they think they're fighting for. They are, in a sense, captive to their own understanding of the world, and they allow that understanding to define their actions and thoughts. Freedom, in Kafka's world, is a psychological condition, and it's something that requires inner liberation, not just external rebellion. Joseph K. believes that by navigating the system, by appealing to the right people, or by finding the right explanation for his arrest, he will be able to escape. But this belief is what traps him. It's not the system that keeps him locked, and it's his belief that the system can be understood and outwitted. His fight is doomed from the start because he's locked into a narrative that sees freedom as something that can be won through external struggle. Kafka's philosophy, when understood through the lens of the trial, becomes a powerful critique of our own mental imprisonments. We all know that the world can be absurd, irrational, and full of invisible systems that feel beyond our control. But Kafka's work forces us to ask, are we really free if we don't examine how we are mentally enslaved by our own thoughts, beliefs, and assumptions? There's a lot of truth in this when we look at how our own society functions. In the modern world, we are constantly bound by expectations. What society deems success, what our families expect of us, what our friends think we should be doing with our lives. We are often prisoners of our own ambitions and the way we measure our worth against the standards that others impose on us. But how often do we stop to consider that maybe these constraints are self-imposed? How many of us feel trapped by a career path we feel we have to follow, or by societal norms about what success looks like? Kafka would argue that the real prison is not these external forces, but the way we buy into these external definitions of our lives. We, like Joseph K., become prisoners to the systems we believe are unchangeable. We think we have no choice but to follow the rules of society, and so we spend our lives fighting within the confines of that system, without realizing that freedom is found when we stop fighting and simply accept the inherent absurdity of life. Kafka seems to say that freedom isn't about escaping the system. It's about accepting the system and choosing to live fully within it without letting it control us. It's about relinquishing the need to control everything, to make sense of everything, and instead embracing life for what it is. Kafka challenges us to reconsider what it means to be truly free. Is it about having complete control over our circumstances? Is it about breaking free from the systems that define us? Or is it, perhaps, about releasing the grip on our need for control, accepting that the world won't always make sense, and that we might never be able to make sense of it? Freedom, in Kafka's world, is found in letting go of the idea that everything can or should be figured out. It's about finding peace with the chaos of life, embracing the uncertainty, rather than constantly struggling to escape it. There's a liberation in accepting that we are all part of something much bigger than ourselves, a world that is fundamentally unpredictable and uncontrollable. We don't have to have all the answers to live freely. Kafka's works teach us that sometimes the hardest part of life is not the external struggle, but the inner struggle against our own need for certainty. Joseph K. is trapped not just by the system, but by the idea that he can understand it, control it, and eventually overcome it. In the end, this very belief is what imprisons him. This internal form of freedom doesn't come easily. It requires us to question our own assumptions about control, success, and failure. It forces us to let go of the need to fix everything or make it conform to our expectations. For Kafka, the path to freedom is not through domination of the external world, but through the ability to accept its inherent chaos and absurdity. It's only when we stop trying to fix everything, to understand everything, and to change everything that we can begin to feel truly liberated. Kafka's work invites us to confront the illusion of control and to ask ourselves difficult questions. How often do we imprison ourselves by seeking certainty in a world that is defined by its uncertainty? How often do we give up our freedom by subscribing to external definitions of success, morality, or justice? Kafka's answer is not to reject the world around us or to give in to despair. Instead, it's to embrace the freedom that comes from seeing the world as it is, without the need for it to fit into a narrative that makes sense. Only then can we escape the real prison that holds us back, the one that exists in our minds. Kafka's works are often characterized by an unflinching exploration of the absurdity of bureaucracy, a system that strips individuals of their humanity, reducing them to nothing more than cogs in a vast, impersonal machine. In his most famous works, such as The Trial and The Castle, Kafka paints a haunting portrait of individuals who are caught in bureaucratic systems that are built on irrational rules and meaningless rituals. His characters are often unable to make sense of the world around them, much less navigate the labyrinthine structures that seem to govern their lives. These systems are not just inefficient, they are fundamentally dehumanizing, trapping individuals in a world where their struggles are ignored, their efforts are fruitless, and their humanity is often erased. Kafka's portrayal of bureaucratic systems is both timeless and eerily modern. His characters, most notably Joseph K. in The Trial and K. in The Castle, find themselves ensnared in systems that don't just fail to recognize their individuality but actively suppress it. In The Trial, Joseph K. is accused of an unnamed crime and forced to navigate a judicial system that operates on arbitrary rules and faceless authority. He cannot even determine what crime he's being accused of, let alone defend himself in any meaningful way. The more Joseph K. tries to fight the system, the more he is drawn into an ever-deepening nightmare of bureaucratic absurdity. What's striking about Kafka's work is how it depicts bureaucracy not as a simple obstacle to overcome, but as a fundamental part of the human condition. In The Trial, the bureaucracy is a living, breathing entity that shapes and controls the lives of its citizens. The system is cold, indifferent, and unforgiving, and Kafka's characters are utterly powerless against it. The more they struggle to fit in, to understand it, to make sense of it, the more they are rejected by it. It's a vicious cycle that Kafka shows is nearly impossible to escape. The absurdity of bureaucracy is not just about inefficiency, it's about the alienation that systems like these foster. Kafka understood that bureaucracy, in its purest form, doesn't just control people's actions, it controls their very identities. In the world Kafka creates, individuals are stripped of any personal significance, reduced to numbers, labels, or faceless participants in an ever-expanding machine. What Kafka is illustrating is not merely a critique of the state, the law, or corporations, but rather an exploration of how bureaucratic systems systematically obliterate the humanity of the individual. They strip us of our identities, our autonomy, and even our dignity. Kafka's characters are repeatedly thwarted in their attempts to communicate or make sense of the system, and in their efforts, they only become more entangled in its web. The most painful aspect of Kafka's critique is that the systems in his stories don't just fail to help, they actively harm. Kafka's characters do not simply experience frustration or confusion as they encounter bureaucratic structures, they experience a loss of self. The more they try to engage with the system, the more they are dehumanized. They are trapped in a world where the rules themselves are absurd, where the structures they are forced to interact with are built on power rather than logic or justice. These systems don't work for people, they work against them. In a world defined by bureaucratic absurdity, humans are left to flounder in a sea of meaningless regulations and arbitrary decision-making. Kafka's critique of bureaucracy resonates strongly with modern readers because, despite being written in the early 20th century, his portrayal of bureaucratic alienation feels remarkably prescient. In today's world, we find ourselves navigating a system where large institutions, be they government agencies, banks, corporations, or healthcare systems, often operate in ways that feel utterly disconnected from the reality of the individuals caught up in them. Think about how we interact with big corporations or public services. We are often reduced to a number, a file, or a case. We fill out endless forms, deal with automated systems, and are passed from one faceless representative to another. The personal touch, the human element, is often lost in the process, and we are left to feel like little more than a cog in the machine. Kafka's works remind us that bureaucracy is not just about inefficiency. It is about the alienation that comes with being reduced to a system's objective, impersonal logic. We are no longer treated as individuals with unique experiences, emotions, and needs. Instead, we become numbers, names on a list, accounts in a ledger, or case files to be processed. In Kafka's world, this alienation leads to a profound sense of helplessness and despair. The system's rules are not designed to empower individuals. They are designed to control and suppress them. The impact of Kafka's critique extends far beyond the realm of literature. In today's world, bureaucratic systems are often more complex and more pervasive than ever before. With the rise of technological systems, automation, and artificial intelligence, we are increasingly caught in an abstract web of rules and processes that seem to exist far beyond our control. Our interactions with these systems are often mediated by machines or impersonal protocols, and we are left to wonder if anyone is truly in charge, or if we are just being shuffled through a process that's designed to run without us. Kafka's portrayal of bureaucracy calls us to reflect on how much of our lives we allow to be governed by external forces, how much of our time, energy, and identity are spent navigating systems that don't care about us. It challenges us to question whether we are being treated as individuals with needs, desires, and agency, or whether we are simply another entry in a database, subject to a set of rules that don't consider our humanity. In the trial, Joseph K. spends his entire life trying to prove his innocence, but by the end, we realize that his real crime wasn't breaking the law. His real crime was being caught up in a system that had no interest in justice, a system that was only concerned with maintaining its own existence. In modern society, we often find ourselves in similar situations. We deal with bureaucracies every day, from healthcare systems that make us wait for hours to speak to a doctor, to banks that treat us like faceless clients, to government institutions that impose endless paperwork and regulations. How often do we feel like we're battling against a system that seems indifferent to our existence? Kafka's works remind us that this is not just a modern inconvenience, it is a fundamental aspect of the human condition. We are often caught in a web of rules and regulations that we don't fully understand, and our attempts to break free or change our circumstances are often thwarted by the sheer weight of bureaucracy. But Kafka also hints at a deeper truth. There is power in rejecting these systems, not by fighting them head-on, but by refusing to let them define who we are. Kafka's protagonists are often victims of their own expectations. They believe that they can fight against the system, that if they understand the rules, they can somehow win. But Kafka's deeper message is that the real power lies in letting go of the need to win, in refusing to allow these systems to define us, to dictate our worth, or to shape our identity. In a world dominated by bureaucracy, we can find power in choosing not to be defined by it. This doesn't mean rejecting all systems or opting out of society, but it means not allowing bureaucracy to strip us of our humanity. Kafka's work suggests that true freedom comes not from escaping the system entirely, but from choosing how to engage with it or how not to engage with it at all. It's about recognizing the absurdity of these systems and choosing to navigate them in a way that preserves our humanity and autonomy. Kafka teaches us that we are not our systems, and that while we may be forced to navigate them, they do not have to define us. Kafka's treatment of alienation and isolation is one of the most striking aspects of his work, and it speaks deeply to the human experience. His characters, often trapped in systems they can't control or understand, find themselves distanced not only from society, but from their very selves. These experiences of isolation are often physical, but more importantly, they are psychological and emotional, affecting the core of their being. Kafka doesn't simply portray alienation as an unfortunate condition. He shows it as a defining feature of the human condition, something that is inherent to our existence. One of the most profound examples of this isolation comes in the Metamorphosis, where Gregor Samsa wakes up one morning to find himself transformed into a giant insect. While his physical transformation is the catalyst for his alienation, What Kafka explores more deeply is the emotional and social alienation that follows. At first, Gregor's family is simply shocked, but as the story progresses, their response to his new form becomes one of rejection. His family, who once depended on him, gradually withdraws from him, seeing him less as the person they loved and more as a burden to be hidden away. His isolation deepens not only because of his transformation, but because the people who should understand him, the people he loved and supported, begin to treat him as something other. They no longer see him as Gregor, they see him as the insect. Kafka's portrayal of Gregor's alienation is not just a reflection on how society rejects what is different, but a commentary on how deeply our identities are tied to the roles we play in society. Gregor's identity was once shaped by his ability to provide for his family, but as soon as he is no longer able to fulfill that role, he loses his value in the eyes of those around him. Kafka suggests that our sense of self is fragile, easily shattered by circumstances. And what's more, the distance that grows between Gregor and his family shows how easily love can be conditional, based on usefulness and role fulfillment, rather than genuine, unconditional acceptance. This alienation, emotional and social, is something Kafka saw as central to the human condition. In the trial, Joseph K. also experiences a profound sense of alienation, although his circumstances are somewhat different. Unlike Gregor, who becomes physically isolated after his transformation, Joseph K. begins the story surrounded by people. He is not literally alone. He has co-workers, a lawyer, even lovers, but he is alienated in a much deeper way. He is cut off from any sense of control or understanding about his situation. The more he tries to make sense of his arrest and trial, the more isolated he becomes. The legal system he is dealing with is so labyrinthine, so opaque, that it isolates him not only from society but from his own understanding of himself. He is constantly surrounded by others, yet the psychological distance between him and everyone else grows ever wider. Even when he is physically in a room with others, there's a sense that he's not really there. He's out of sync with everyone else, unable to find a meaningful connection. Kafka's exploration of alienation isn't limited to the physical or even emotional distance characters feel from others. It's also about the distance they feel from themselves. Kafka's characters often suffer from a deep existential disconnect, where they can no longer recognize or understand the selves they once knew. They are caught in a web of absurdity, struggling to understand who they are and where they fit in a world that seems completely indifferent to their existence. This kind of internal alienation is perhaps the most profound and the most difficult to overcome because it's not just about external forces rejecting you. It's about feeling lost within your own mind and body. This theme of alienation is universal. We may not all experience the extreme forms of isolation that Kafka's characters do, but his exploration of psychological and emotional alienation speaks to a deeper truth about the human experience. In many ways, we are all alienated, and that alienation comes in different forms. We are alienated from others, from ourselves, and from the world around us. In a world increasingly dominated by technology, we may find ourselves more connected than ever online, yet paradoxically more isolated in person. Social media, for example, allows us to project an image of ourselves, to share our lives and experiences with others. But it also creates an environment where we feel constantly judged, constantly needing to present ourselves in a certain way to gain validation. We are always seeking approval, but often feel more alone than ever before. In Kafka's world, this kind of alienation is inevitable. The systems that control us are indifferent to our individual needs. They dehumanize us, treating us as nothing more than components of a larger machine. Kafka shows us that external alienation, being isolated by society, by others, pales in comparison to internal alienation, where we feel disconnected from our very sense of self. Kafka's characters often feel out of place in the world, disconnected from their own sense of purpose or identity. This is something we all experience in different ways, whether it's the feeling of not fitting in, of being misunderstood, or of simply not being able to connect with others in a meaningful way. Kafka's works resonate deeply with anyone who has ever questioned their place in the world. Kafka doesn't just present alienation as a tragedy, though. He presents it as an essential part of the human condition, a condition that, once accepted, can offer freedom. By embracing our alienation, by accepting that we are not always going to be understood, not always going to find a perfect fit within society, we can begin to break free from the need to conform. Alienation, in Kafka's world, is a double-edged sword. Yes, it leads to isolation, but it also gives us the freedom to see ourselves as individuals rather than mere products of societal expectations. The alienation Kafka portrays doesn't have to be a prison. It can be a form of liberation. Once we stop looking to others to validate us, once we stop trying to fit into a system that doesn't recognize our unique humanity, we can begin to embrace the freedom to live authentically. Kafka's exploration of alienation points to the possibility of a kind of freedom that comes from being at peace with our own isolation. This is not a call to withdraw from the world entirely, but rather to find strength in our independence from the external world. By acknowledging our own alienation not as something to fight against, but as something inherent to the human experience, we can start to see ourselves not as victims of our circumstances, but as agents of our own existence. We live in a world where connection is increasingly digital, and human interaction is often mediated by technology. While technology allows us to stay connected across vast distances, it often deepens the sense of isolation. The more connected we are online, the more disconnected we often feel from the real, physical world. Social media allows us to construct perfect versions of ourselves, but these versions are often hollow, and this emptiness leads to a sense of alienation. Kafka's works remind us that we need to make peace with being alone. In fact, embracing solitude may be one of the most liberating things we can do. Rather than constantly seeking external validation, we can learn to validate ourselves, understanding that our worth is not dependent on the approval of others. Kafka's writings show us that alienation is not something to be feared. In fact, it may be the key to understanding and accepting ourselves. The more we try to fit into a world that is indifferent to our individual needs, the more isolated we feel. But when we accept that alienation is an inherent part of the human condition, we can begin to live freely, free from the pressures of society, free from the need for approval, and free to embrace who we truly are. Kafka's works show us that sometimes it is in our isolation that we can find the greatest freedom, the freedom to be ourselves, to define our own identities, and to live our own truth. Kafka's exploration of the human condition brings us face to face with uncomfortable truths. His works challenge us to confront the absurdity of life, the alienation that defines so much of the human experience, and the limits of our personal freedom in a world often governed by irrational systems. At first glance, his philosophy might seem bleak, even nihilistic. His characters are often trapped in bureaucratic nightmares, existential despair, and relationships that turn toxic the moment they become too real. But beneath these grim realities lies an essential truth that Kafka imparts to us. While life may be absurd, and we may struggle to find our place in it, there is a freedom that comes from accepting the absurd. There is a way to live authentically by embracing the very chaos that seems to oppress us. One of Kafka's most significant contributions to philosophical thought is his challenge to the traditional understanding of freedom. In Kafka's world, freedom is not an external condition that can be granted or taken away by society or by political systems. Rather, freedom is internal, a state of mind, a way of seeing and being in the world that does not rely on external validation or societal approval. This is a radical departure from the way we typically think about freedom in modern life, where freedom is often equated with the ability to control external circumstances. Kafka's characters, such as Joseph K. in The Trial or Gregor Samsa in the Metamorphosis, seek to escape systems that oppress them, but their real struggle is not with the systems themselves. Their real struggle is with their own beliefs about freedom and their inability to accept life as it truly is, a chaotic, irrational, and fundamentally indifferent existence. Kafka's works also teach us that alienation is inevitable, part of the fabric of the human condition. We are all alienated in some way from ourselves, from others, and from the world around us. Kafka's characters reflect this universal truth through their experiences of being cut off from the people they love or from society as a whole. In the Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa's transformation into an insect makes him physically alienated from his family. But it also represents a deeper psychological alienation, the isolation that comes when we are no longer able to fulfill the roles we have been assigned by society. In the trial, Joseph K.'s alienation is not physical, but emotional and intellectual. He is trapped in a world where he cannot understand the rules or make sense of his existence. Yet Kafka doesn't treat alienation as a tragedy in the traditional sense. Instead, he presents it as something we must accept, not as a weakness, but as an essential part of life. In acknowledging our alienation, Kafka suggests we can begin to free ourselves from the constraints of social expectation and define our own identities. Kafka's philosophy is perhaps most valuable because it teaches us to stop searching for meaning in external systems, whether those systems are social, political, or cultural. We are often taught that meaning comes from success, from recognition, from fitting into the roles that society deems important. But Kafka's characters, who are often trapped in systems that do not care about them as individuals, teach us that true meaning must be created within ourselves. The key to understanding Kafka's work is not to search for a clear, definitive answer to the problems he presents, but to understand that meaning itself is subjective. Meaning is something we create in how we live our lives, in the stories we tell about ourselves, and in the freedom we find by accepting the absurdity of existence. What Kafka offers us is not just a bleak worldview, but a path to liberation. By accepting the absurd nature of life, by acknowledging that we can't control everything and that we can't always make sense of the world, we can begin to embrace the journey itself, rather than obsessing over an idealized destination. In many ways, Kafka's writings suggest that the search for meaning is itself meaningless. What matters is not finding the answers, but living with the questions, embracing the unknown, and creating our own purpose even in the face of uncertainty. In this way, Kafka's works can be seen as an invitation to find freedom, not through resistance, but through acceptance of the world as it is. Kafka's characters are often defeated by their inability to accept life's absurdity. They struggle to understand systems that don't care about them. They fight for freedom in a world that doesn't offer it, and they grapple with isolation in a society that offers no easy answers. But Kafka's legacy is not one of despair. It's a legacy of resilience. It's a reminder that even in the face of incomprehensible systems and a universe that offers no clear meaning, there is still freedom to be found in how we choose to live. Kafka shows us that suffering can have its own kind of beauty if we learn to face it with courage, to embrace it with grace, and to find our own meaning in the process. Kafka's stories are not just about suffering, they are about finding beauty in failure, embracing the absurdity of life, and learning to live with purpose, even when that purpose is unclear. The lesson Kafka imparts to us is one of acceptance, not of an external, organized meaning, but of the freedom to create meaning for ourselves. When we accept life's inherent chaos, when we acknowledge our own alienation, and when we stop looking to external systems for validation, we free ourselves to live authentically. Kafka teaches us that true liberation comes not from fighting against the systems that surround us, but from accepting those systems for what they are and finding the strength to live our lives in a way that doesn't depend on them. Ultimately, Kafka's philosophy suggests that life is an ongoing struggle, one that may never offer clear answers or resolutions. But in that struggle, we find our purpose by embracing the absurd, by rejecting the need to fit into predetermined roles, and by creating meaning from within. We can live our lives fully, despite the uncertainty and chaos. Kafka's legacy, then, is one of freedom, the freedom that comes from accepting life as it is, rather than as we wish it to be, the freedom that comes from creating our own purpose, our own meaning, and our own path through the absurdity of existence.